Welcome to Sunday School. Hello, I'm your instructor, Father Timothy Matkin at St. Francis Anglican Church in Dallas. And during this pandemic, we thought, well, we haven't been able to get together for a while. Let's have some Sunday School. Let's have some Christian instruction. And we believe that Christian formation and study is very valuable. So I thought, well, let's put it together and put it online, and we'll go from there. Where to start? Well, let's just start with the basics. And our former rector, Father Homer Rogers, had a great course that was put together into a book called the Romance of Orthodoxy. I'm going to put that down below. And basically, I'm taking his notes, and also that was taken and tweaked by Father Cantrell, Richard Cantrell, and then I took that and I added a few things and mostly did some condensing down in some places to make it a little briefer. But that's what we'll have today. We'll look at Christian basics over the series of these lectures, and I hope you will continue to join us and pass it along to someone else who might be interested in learning more about the Christian faith. Well, we'll begin each session with prayer, and I'm going to grab my Book of Common Prayer. This is the one from the Church of England, the 1662 Book of Common Prayer, and we'll begin with this prayer, which is one of the great standard collects used in the Church. It's worth using in your own life, too. Let us pray. Prevent us, O Lord, in all our doings with thy most gracious favor, and further us with thy continual help, that in all our works, begun, continued, and ended in thee, we may glorify thy holy name, and finally, by thy mercy, obtain everlasting life, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. A wonderful prayer. It talks about prevenient grace. When it says prevent, it doesn't mean stop. It means the grace of God that goes before us, that paves the way, makes everything smooth and easy, just like John the Baptist, paving the way for the Messiah. Well, today we're going to begin with a lecture on reality and religion, just like you see behind me. Now, we all have to face reality, and everyone has trouble with reality, with all of reality, with their neighbors, with things in their life, within themselves. And the common human experience is that there is difficulty, disorder, pain, suffering, confusion. And we notice how every religion attempts to make sense of our experience, our problems with reality. And different religions have given different names to that universal problem, but they're all talking about really the same thing. Buddhism, for example, takes as its starting point the statement, there is suffering. Christianity speaks in a very similar way about what we call original sin. Since everyone in the world has these same basic problems, everyone in the world has some kind of religion, whether they recognize that or not. What is religion exactly? Well, religion is any system of belief and practice really aimed at restoring one to a kind of harmony or unity with their reality. And that very word, religion, comes from two Latin terms, re, again, and legare, to tie. And so religion literally means to tie things back together again. Some people's religion, the way they handle their experience of reality, is in their church. But not everyone's religion is connected with their church going. That is, even some who go to church regularly are actually trusting in something else to solve the basic problems of life. They're trusting in science or wealth or power. Some have no church, but they still have religion. The discrepancy, in fact, between one's real religion and their church practice is simply another example of that universal human condition of dislocation and alienation. A person's real religion is whatever he or she is trusting in to do the job of restoring unity and meaning to life and put them at peace with the experience of reality. So the kind of religion you have depends upon the assumptions that you make about reality. Now, there are different views of reality. There is materialism, idealism, and realism. The most common notion especially today, is that matter is stuff. You know, what you can see and touch, hear, taste, smell. The idea is that matter is real. And so this is called materialism. But this kind of reality, you notice, is not permanent and fixed. Matter is subject to the Second Law of Thermodynamics. The material world around us is always changing, wearing out, running down, rusting, drying out, disintegrating, changing into something else. For example, you see this in the middle of a very fine neighborhood where all the houses were built around the same time, about 50 years ago. There stands one that's been vacant for decades. It's terribly dilapidated, and the children say it's haunted. Something has changed. The pyramids of Egypt were once plated with polished marble. Imagine that sight. They're still there, but now all that's left are those huge steps of rough stone. Thousands of great old movies with actors like Will Rogers. Texans should love Will Rogers. So many of them have perished because the nitrate film stock used for the negatives have disintegrated or caught fire. And we lost them before they had a chance to be preserved and restored. When you stop to think on the fact of universal impermanence, you're likely to get a bit down, fall into the mood of the writer of the Old Testament book of Ecclesiastes, who said, "All is vanity," especially after periods of great upheaval, a rapid social change, like back in the 1960s, and maybe, frankly, today. People look around for what seems to be dependable. Many, of course, want to get rid of the old institutions that no longer seem relevant. But deep down, people want something to hold on to. They want something permanent and lasting. Thus, in the 4th century BC, Plato was looking for that which is permanent and abiding. And he explained his little thought experiment like this. He said, "You notice how little green apples, they grow up and mature into red apples, and then they fall off the tree, and finally they decay on the ground and they're gone. And then the next year, the same thing happens all over again. Apparently, apples do not abide. But there is something about them that does abide. We'll call it appleness, or the idea of appleness. Thus, there's a kind of reality that doesn't depend upon the material, physical world. So 2 plus 2 still equals 4, whether or not you have two things and two things to add together or not, as in fact Pythagoras had already observed before Plato. According to Plato, then, the ideas form a hierarchy. At the top, there is God, and under him, the pure things like the good and the true and the beautiful. And then down at the bottom, there are the ideas of such specific things like apples. And the specific things of this world are not real, but they're only the reflections of what is really real, the idea, the prototype. And so Plato's approach to reality is thus called idealism, not to be confused with the more common use of the word, which refers to having lofty ideals. Plato, the philosopher, of course, had a number of students. The students learned from him, didn't always agree with him. One of them, named Aristotle, responded, "Hey, look, when you're hungry, you want an apple. You don't want the idea of an apple or appleness." So Aristotle said, look, reality involves the union of the idea with the matter. Reality, he says, is to be found in the thing, the res in Latin, which expresses or conveys that idea. And so his notion is called realism. For example, if I have a broken radio and I take it apart to fix it, then I no longer have a radio, but I have a box of parts. And even if I go and buy a new part to replace the old bad one, I still need something else. I need someone who understands radios and can put all the parts together right. And this put together rightness is called the form. The stuff that it's made of is called the matter. So according to Aristotle, reality is really the union of form and matter. In other words, like a house is not just a set of blueprints, nor is a house a pile of lumber and nails and paint and so on. It is these materials put together right, that is, according to the form supplied by the blueprints. In other words, reality is the marriage of pattern and matter. And there's a little play on words going on there. In the Greek, pater, father, mater, mother. When father and mother are joined together, they give birth to reality. As we analyze anything in the universe, we discover at every step there is form or pattern plus the stuff, the matter. Even at the lowest level, the subatomic level, it is pattern plus the stuff of, at that level, just energy. Energy in pattern. Pattern dynamic, moving, but it is still pattern. A dancing reality of energy. Let's talk about dogma. Everyone's lifestyle is based on the assumption that one or other of these things, these notions of reality, materialism, idealism, or realism, or some combination of them or something else, the assumption that this is true, that this is the way it really is. This assumption is simply taken for granted most of the time. It can be very difficult to question your own basic assumptions. Such unquestioned assumptions by which we live are psychologically what we call dogmas. So, for example, Johnny asks his mother, "Mama, why does water run downhill?" Mama says, "Well, because of the law of gravity." "Mama, what's the law of gravity?" "Well, the fact that water runs downhill." "Oh, yes, Mama, but why?" "Well, honey, it just does." Or if Mother is religious, she might say, "Well, that's the way God wanted it to be." The reality that water runs downhill is Mother's dogma. Dogmas are not normally explained. Rather, they are what you use to explain other things. Dogmas, by definition, are taken for granted, usually introduced by a phrase like, "Well, everyone knows." In science, that which is found to be dogmatic is what we call a law of nature, the things that always are this way. Dogmas are thus not negotiable. They're just what you live by, and it can be very threatening to have your dogmas called into question. Dogmas are the things you bet your life on day in and day out without giving it a single thought. You operate in your daily world like there is a law of gravity, like water is always going to run downhill, and so on. Now, doctrines, on the other hand, are not the same thing as dogmas. Doctrines, teachings, can be explained, are often explained, and they are either negotiable or can be freely received or rejected. An explanation of the doctrine is kind of the translation of an experience or an idea, which is puzzling and causes anxiety, into more familiar terms in which it can be understood and that anxiety removed. For example, picture, back in 1960, a Japanese soldier is discovered in the jungles of New Guinea, and he's been hiding out there for 15 years, not knowing that the war is over. And when he gets back to Japan, he sees all kinds of things that have changed over the years. He sees television for the first time. And they explain to him that the picture is, well, it's transmitted using the principles of radio. You know, it's waves going through the air, and the machine takes those waves and puts it into a picture and sound. And he gets it. That satisfies him. It explains everything. But a bushman from New Guinea, if he goes to Japan and he sees television for the first time, he thinks it's magic. And there's no way to explain it to him because he has no experience in terms of which he can understand it. And so our purpose is not to explain Christianity, for Christianity is not the problem. The problem, we might say, is human life, and Christianity is the explanation. Now, life is what we might say awful in terms of awe. That is, the more deeply we reflect upon human experience, the good things as well as the bad things, the more we are often moved to awe. Awe is a mixture of fear and fascination. Awe is the emotional basis of primitive religion. In moments of awe, we experience our lack of harmony with reality. Awe is the reaction to mystery. A puzzle can be explained, whereas a mystery really can't. Mystery is a reality that can be apprehended, but not comprehended or explained. We can touch it, as it were, but we can't wrap our arms around it. For example, interstellar space is a mystery. Interstellar space is like the room in which stars and planets and galaxies exist. So much I can apprehend. But does it have a limit? Where are the walls of this room? I can't imagine it just coming to a stop after the last celestial body. But on the other hand, I can't really imagine it going on forever and ever either. It's something I can apprehend, but it's definitely not something I can comprehend. I can't wrap my mind around that. As a rational creature, the way I domesticate experience is by wrapping my mind around it, as it were. But some things you just can't do that. And when we encounter mystery, we find paradox or dilemma. We find choices that are unmakeable, and mystery is to simply let them stand the way they are. And there are natural mysteries and supernatural mysteries. So interstellar space is an example of natural mystery. Jesus is an example of supernatural mystery. He is, at the same time, both God and man. God and man are so different, and yet here he is, both two natures in one person. Now, we're often tempted to choose one of the two terms of the dilemma in order to resolve it simply by ignoring the other side. In fact, the great heresies of the early church all started out that way, by ignoring one of the two sides of a great dilemma in a great mystery. Well, now let's switch gears and have a little story time. Father Rogers was described to me as the barnyard Thomist. And that is to say, a great mind, but who could boil things down like Jesus, telling stories, simple stories for common people. And so here we have some simple stories that lay out a great phenomenology about the origin of primitive religion, talking about the relationship of one's dogmas about reality and religion. So, for example, Exhibit A, John Smith, the Greek chicken farmer. So Greece, of course, is not, it's not like Nebraska. It's not all flat. It's got these great mountains and valleys and rivers. A lot of valleys that run down to the Mediterranean, like fingers on a hand reaching out to the sea. And most of them have rivers going down these valleys to the sea. Now, long before the classical period of Greek history and long before chickens were actually imported from India, let's say there was a chicken farmer in Greece named John Smith. I know that's not a very Greek name, but we'll just go with that for the moment. Let's say he lived in one of these valleys, several miles from the village at the mouth of the river. And his usual route to the village was along this winding river bank. And in one such bend in the river, there was a densely packed wood. And once he was on his way to the village with a basket full of eggs from his chickens to swap for arrowheads or something, when he decided to take a shortcut through the woods. And in the middle of the woods, he came upon a clearing that he'd never discovered before. And, it's about 30 feet across. And the surrounding trees grew exceptionally close together, very tall. It was almost like a great wall, like he was in a great open-air temple. And there was not much light there or much wind, only an occasional breeze coming through. In the center of the clearing, there was this rock, a flat-topped, rocky outcropping. And he found it strangely quiet and peaceful there. And so he began to make a habit to come and stop and rest there every time he went to town. And when he was in town one day, he mentioned to a friend the place that he had found in the woods. He said, "Hey, have you ever been there?" And the guy says, "Yeah, I know exactly the place that you're talking about. I stop there sometimes too. And I get the creepiest feeling, like I'm being watched, like I'm not alone. I wonder if, whose ever place this is, does he mind if we use it like that from time to time?" And so John Smith replies, "Yeah, I wonder about that too." And so then the next time he's going to town and he stops there, John Smith really gets the jitters, and that conversation comes up in his mind, what if? Does he mind if we're here? And so he took an egg out of the basket and he placed it on the rock. And then he said out loud, "Well, whoever you are, this here is for you. I just want to say thank you for letting me visit your place." So what do we see happening in this story here? Well, John Smith had offered a sacrifice as a means of dealing with this experience of awe. And there are two parts to a sacrifice. There's something done, and then there's something said to interpret and explain the thing that you did. And if we had visited that place 1,000 years after John Smith, we probably would have discovered that his descendants had become a tribe of hereditary priests. In addition to raising chickens, their job was to offer sacrifices regularly in a temple standing over that flat rock in the clearing. And 20 miles away, there was probably another clearing in the middle of a wood. And elsewhere in Greece, there were mountains with peculiar barren tops where the wind always whistled, and there were waterfalls and echoing canyons and all sorts of fascinating and frighteningly strange and mysterious places all over Greece. So for John Smith, the place itself was a god. This is the Greek word daemon. It almost seemed to have a personality. It was spooky. It's like a haunted house. In the course of time, the god of this forest kind of merged and was amalgamated with the god of that forest and the god of that forest. And so it became the god of forests in general. And the processes of nature were John's gods, Mother Nature, who was entirely immanent, that is to say, remaining down to earth, entirely within this world. The early Greeks worshipped nature with her mystery and power and wonder. And so the name for this religion is called Pantheism, the idea that all is God, from the Greek pan, all, and theos, God, Pantheism. And their religion involved shrines and sacrifices and drinking and dancing in the streets. And it was a religion of fun. It had only one commandment: just be natural, follow your impulses. But it had one fatal weakness: be natural, follow your impulses. It couldn't support a morality because it assumed that nature is all there is and everything is natural. So it doesn't provide any way to tell good from bad or to distinguish a lesser good from a greater good. Following his impulses, a man sooner or later gets the impulse to make love to his neighbor's wife. And then his neighbor gets the impulse to bash his brains in. The problem, you see, is that tigers are just as natural as little fluffy bunny rabbits. And there's no animal as debased as a human being who tries to live like an animal. Any approach to living which puts all of one's confidence in mastering nature, that's what we call pantheism. Many Americans today really are pantheists because they put their trust in nature. Or we might say today, they're putting their trust in science and technology, which are simply means of understanding and manipulating the processes of nature. So the trouble is that the morality of pantheism is no morality. It's just, if it's fun, do it. If it's natural, that's all there is. Who cares? So that's Exhibit A, John Smith, the Greek chicken farmer. Exhibit B, A.B. McGillicuddy. With Father Rogers, there's always a McGillicuddy in there. Now, he's the Semitic sheep herder. So A.B. was a nomad. A nomad wanders around from place to place, wandering through Israel, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Arabia, what we call the Middle East. It's not really the Middle East, it's the Near East, but that's what people call it. And, he could only stay in one place for a week or two until his sheep had eaten up all the grass, and there wasn't a whole lot of that around. And so he and his family would have to pack up the tents and move on and find another grazing place. And one day he was out with his flock in the open range, and suddenly an electrical storm came up, as it often does in that part of the world. And he was caught out there without any shelter. And so all he could do was just sit and watch. And he looked up at the marvelous display of fireworks in the heavens. And he listened to the rumble of the thunder. It was thundering right over here just now. And he was scared silly, but he was also so fascinated. That is to say, there's the thunder again. I don't know if you can pick it up on here. But he had this experience of awe, and he lived to tell about it. And a few weeks later, when he was in a different place, because he'd moved on, because he's a nomad, so he's like, 25 miles down the road, he saw another electrical storm, and he had a similar experience. And then later on, he was camped out near a volcanic mountain, which began to erupt. And fire and sparks were shooting out the top of it, and there was great rumbling. Dark clouds billowed out. The earth under his feet was shaking. It seemed that his old friend, the storm god, or was it his enemy, had gotten into the mountain and was tearing it apart. Talk about power. And so A.B.'s God turned out to be not the God of one particular place, which was equal to any other place. His God was different. It was other than nature, and indeed sometimes appeared to be hostile to nature. And when that God came into contact with the things of nature, nature was what got the worst of it. In the words of Psalm 104, the earth shall tremble at the look of him. If he do but touch the hills, they shall smoke. And so A.B.'s God was above and beyond nature. That is to say, he transcended nature. A.B.'s God was not localized. Whenever it seemed that he was about to be localized, something happened to make A.B. move, and then A.B. found God again in his new home. First it was on Mount Horeb, and also called Mount Sinai, and then it was Shiloh, and then Mount Zion in Jerusalem. And when Solomon built the temple, there it seemed A.B.'s God would stay for good. But even then, A.B. wasn't able to keep God there. The northern kingdom moved God's presence to Mount Gerizim in the ark, only to have the ark carted off by the Assyrians, or have the country, the people, carted off. The southern kingdom was carried into captivity as well in Babylon, where they learned to find God there and worship him in a strange land. So the God of the Hebrews was an awful God. Remember that word, awe and mystery, who was outside nature and sometimes against her. Sometimes he was angry. The prophet Isaiah in the 8th century BC described him as high and lifted up, surrounded by angels who are calling back and forth to each other around him, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God of hosts, and they hide their faces from his presence. The whole temple shook and was filled with smoke, and the vision of God made Isaiah himself feel quite unclean. You can read this story in Isaiah chapter 6, by the way. Now to A.B. it seemed that he must turn his back on nature if he was to please his God. He must deny his natural impulses. And so A.B. was basically a Puritan, A.B.'s religion was always kind of putting the damper on fun. A.B.'s morality said, in contrast to the Greek, if it's fun, don't do it. That means it's wrong. A.B.'s religion developed a really vigorous moral system, which is still around today. And there are lots of Puritans around in America, even they that don't call themselves Puritans. Nevertheless, A.B. could never be an entirely thoroughgoing Puritan. I mean, nobody really can entirely. We depend on nature for shelter, food. We have to eat. And it's fun to eat when you have good tasting stuff. And furthermore, at the direction of his God, A.B. settled the land. He settled the land of Canaan, which forced him to stay put, to be a part of his environment, to master farming. And so he was forced to come to terms with nature in his own life. Which leads us to two different forms of religion. Well, now let's talk about two different forms of religion, Greek and Hebrew. Now, the ideal Greek was a nude or semi-nude figure dancing on a hillside with a jug of wine in one hand and a flute in the other. And the Greek sought God in nature by trying to become one with nature, by trying to be as natural as possible. The Greek religion had really no connection with morality. The great Greek moral teacher Socrates was condemned to death for the crime of impiety, not for immorality. The ideal Hebrew was a prophet like Jeremiah or John the Baptist, someone who denounced sin and warned about the wrath of God to come. The Hebrew prophets were always out there denouncing people for trying to substitute the offering of sacrifices for obedience to God, which was far more important than sacrifice. As the prophet Samuel said to King Saul, to obey is better than sacrifice. Until Jesus came, mankind had a choice then. Two kinds of religion, two forms, the kind of religion that the Greek had or the kind of religion that the Hebrew had. Greek pantheism said that God was kind of locked up in nature. That is, God is only immanent or remains in nature. For pantheists, nature is all there is. And so basically they are materialists. Hebrew transcendentalism says that God is outside the natural order and completely separate from it, completely above, beyond it. Transcendentalists, of course, tend to be more Puritans, like those prophets denouncing sin. But the Hebrews were gradually being led by God toward the sacramentalism of the Christian faith. Jesus was born, of course, among the Jews, as a Jew, which compelled those who accepted him as God come in the flesh to combine the viewpoints of both the Greek and the Jew. The Christian believes that the transcendent God is also at the same time immanent in the world. Spirit and matter for the Christian are not enemies. They are two aspects of one reality, because God, who is pure spirit, is also flesh and blood in Jesus of Nazareth. Now, the man on the street, the typical person, has a tendency to be either a Puritan or a materialist because it's just simpler to be one or the other, to choose sides. Which of the two he is depends in part, a lot of times, on how the world around him treats him and his kind. And the same is true of Christian people. When the church itself felt persecuted, it tended to be more puritanical. When it was accepted, it tended to become more materialistic. Christian history, in fact, can be looked at and summarized and symbolized by thinking of the church as like a ship anchored in the middle of the mouth of the great river near the ocean, so that the water level rises and falls with the tide, with the tides of history. The anchor chain is long enough to allow it to rise with the tide, but not long enough to allow it to drift and go aground on either bank, on one side or the other. Now, for this thought experiment, one bank is labeled Puritanism. The other bank is labeled Materialism. If the anchor were to be moved away from the center, then sooner or later the ship would run aground on that side to where you moved it. Now, for about the first 300 years of Christian history, the church was very often persecuted. And even when it wasn't, it was often frowned upon, underground, things like that. So it tended to react in a way that made it puritanical. But in time, God raised up bishops and prophets who reminded her that God created the world and called it good. And in fact, God had entered that world that he made in the person of Jesus. And that in Christ, human nature is united to God for all eternity. And therefore, Christians ought not to be entirely puritanical. They can't call evil that which God has called good, matter. For about the next 200 years, Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, with all that entailed. Everybody was joining up, and it tended to become very worldly and materialistic. And so the tides of history had caused the church's boat to drift more toward the other bank, on the other side. And then God raised up bishops and prophets to remind Christians that their final happiness and fulfillment was not to be found ultimately in this world, but with God in eternity. And so things continued this way for some 1,500 years. The church alternated between periods of Puritanism and periods of materialism, each of them lasting about 200-300 years. And the church was able to ride things out because that anchor of Catholic dogma was securely there right in the middle of the river, balancing out the transcendent and the eminent views of reality. That anchor is Catholic dogma, especially the dogma that God is both transcendent and eminent, the theological mystery that Jesus is both truly God and truly man. But around the year 1500, when the church had been in one of its worldly phases for about 200 years, some of the prophets of that time lost their perspective and they panicked. In those places where they could get the support of the local ruler, they pulled up the anchor, as it were, and hauled it over toward the bank of Puritanism in order to pull the church away from materialism and corruption and not let it return. Well, this event, this upheaval, is what we call the Protestant Reformation. In England, however, although some definitely wanted the anchor moved, the temptation was resisted. The opportunity passed them by. The ancient dogmas, the anchor, was left where it was. But instead there was a serious paddling effort to steer us over to the puritanical side, to try to correct the abuses and move the boat away from materialism. But since they left the anchor and the ancient faith and order intact, the Church of England remained Catholic even through this Protestant mutiny. And here we need some definitions. Catholic refers to that kind of Christianity that has its anchor in the middle of the river. It's the kind of religion which existed universally before the Protestant reformers like Calvin and Luther and Zwingli came along and hauled the anchor over toward the Puritan bank. Protestant, that word properly used in the original sense, meant testifying, protesting against abuses within the life of the church, and also abuses against, or protested against the exaggerated claims of the Pope, the Bishop of Rome. And so the opposite of Protestant is really papal, referring to the Pope. The opposite of Catholic, that word comes from kataholon, according to the whole, often translated universal. The opposite of Catholic is sectarian, not necessarily Protestant. And that sectarian spirit, of course, leads to heresy, the faith that belongs to a particular place, a particular people, a particular time. Heresy means some form of Christianity which is essentially one-sided or leaves out some part of the basic Christian belief. It often takes the form of overemphasizing some aspect of Christian truth at the expense of some other aspect. The word actually is derived from the Greek word eresis, meaning a choice. Heresy is about choosing to leave something out, to kind of pick and choose the parts that appeal to you. It's the cafeteria approach to religion. Make your own religion. Get the pieces that you want. Their emphasis on God's transcendence made the Reformers uncomfortable with the materialism of the sacraments and the sacramental way of looking at things. In moving the anchor, they unintentionally fell into various forms of heresy because they were denying that side, the material side of reality. In some places in Europe, there was such a strong reaction against what the Reformers wanted to do that it took nearly a century for those many abuses that they rightly protested against to be dealt with. In those places where the Puritans won out, Christianity was often perceived in the culture to be official Puritanism and was often simply abandoned because it was perceived that way. People instead professed to be enlightened, and atheism, actual atheism, began to spread. This was characteristic of the 18th century Enlightenment, or the Age of Reason. It appeared to those people that there was a war between science and religion, between reason and faith. They chose reason rather than faith or religion. In fact, the real war was between two false religions, Puritanism and materialism. There is, of course, no war between true science and true Christianity. Since the Reformation, that cycle of 200 to 300 year swings and oscillations has continued, and we may now be coming toward the end of what has been a period of worldliness for Christianity. During the past few centuries, there's been also another cycle at work among Protestant Christians, superimposed on that big basic pattern. After the Puritan Pilgrims had been in this country for a generation or so, they became relatively prosperous. In New England, they were in effect like the established church. And so, naturally, of course, they seemed to get quite worldly, in spite of their Puritan ideology. And so a reaction occurred, and some of the brethren withdrew to form their own church, which would be really Christian. In other words, really Puritan. And that lasted for about a generation or so, and then they got a bit worldly, and then another really Christian church had to be founded, and so on. And so this went on until today there are thousands of different Protestant branches and churches in the United States and around the world. Well, let's put on the screen some of these major turning points to be aware of in the history of Western Christianity. Of course, back at the beginning, you see, we have the origin of the Christian church, the beginning, its birthday, with the resurrection, the ascension, Pentecost. And at this time, as we mentioned, because of persecution, the church tends to be a bit puritanical. And then we have a major turning point. When 312, the Edict of Milan makes Christianity legal, and in fact, after that becomes officially the state religion, and the church tends to become worldly. Everyone is joining, standards are lowered, and that's the way it is for a couple of hundred years. And then around 500, the Roman Empire of the West falls to the barbarians. And so that means the church enters a period of austerity, of Puritan austerity. And then around 800, Charlemagne is crowned emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, a reborn Roman Empire, and the church becomes worldly. And then around 1000, the Crusades are launched to stem the tide of Islam, to free the Holy Land, to make it safe for pilgrims to travel there again. They had been oppressed and murdered and prohibited by the Turks who came to power. And so the church became again austere and vigorous. About 1300, we have peace. The Muslim threat to Europe subsides. Materialism, and with it moral decay, begin to set in. And we find also that the Western church begins to be divided by schisms. In the 1500s, of course, the Reformation begins. Protestant Puritanism becomes established in various places around Europe. And then around 1750, as we mentioned, the Enlightenment happens, the Age of Reason. And there we have the rise of secular rationalism and the fragmentation and the liberalization of Protestant Christianity. And that leads us up to today, with the turn of the 21st century. Now, 35 years earlier, it had certainly seemed that we were on the threshold of a reunion of the Christian church, but no longer. Instead, a drastic realignment seems to be in the making instead. In Western Christianity, there's a great struggle between the secular liberals of Christianity, many of whom in some ways are pantheists, and the traditionalists in the Christian churches who would be tempted more and more to become puritanical in reaction. And so that oscillation continues with the tides of history between materialism and Puritanism. Well, thank you for joining us for this first session on reality and religion. I hope you will join us next week. We will turn to the next subject and talk about God and man. And that time, if you're in Dallas, please come join us at St. Francis Anglican Church. You can look us up on the web at stfrancisdallas.org. Please like and share, and we will see you there. God bless.